Muy buenas tardes a todo el público que nos sigue de manera remota.
Good evening to all of those following us online and also to all the attendees that are physically here in the event for the Global Network on Electoral Justice. We will now start with session number 3, Equal Political Participation. The panel members are Lucy Jeanette Bermudez, Justice of the 5th Section of the Council of State of Colombia. Dania Paola Rabel Cuevas, Counselor of the National Electoral Institute of Mexico. Alberto Dalla Villa, Vice President of National Electoral Chamber of Argentina. Luis López Guerra, Justice of the European Court of Human Rights. And Lourdes González Prieto, Director of the Program in Paraguay for International IDEA, will chair this session. I will now give the floor to Madam Chair.
Buenas tardes. Gracias por su
Good evening. Thank you for being resilient and persistent, still being here at this hour. This is a very interesting topic, but we still have to recover some of the time because we are behind schedule. So I will ask for your help so we can make use of the time as effectively as possible, and so we can abide by the time limits for each intervention, please. I am very honored of being the chair of this high-profile panel, and this is a topic that is of concern for all of us who work in democratic development throughout the world. Political participation, equal political participation. I will just make a brief introduction on this matter. At the core of everything, we have those important lines of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All people are equal in dignity and rights, and this is one of the great challenges faced by democracies due to the situations that we face in our countries in all continents that include inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. Before these problems, we have the obligation to work in order to look for greater equality, greater equity, more inclusion, more respect towards diversity, and to ensure non-discrimination. This is the duty of all of us who work in democratic development in the world, and even more so of the authorities that have to enforce and apply control on these subjects. I'm also very happy to introduce the speakers of the last event that we had yesterday and the day before yesterday, when we had the 9th Ibero-American Conference on Electoral Justice. And at the end of this conference, we drafted the agreement, and among these agreements we have some very important items, very important points regarding this responsibility and obligation that we have on protecting equality, equity, and participation in equal conditions or in better conditions for all groups, for all people, and especially for all underrepresented people and groups. This is why when we issued the final agreement of this 9th Ibero-American Conference, out of the 14 points that make up this final agreement, 6 include elements that talk about equal participation. Of course, I won't read all of them. I will just highlight some of the essential elements. Point number 1, we reiterate the commitment of the participating bodies with independence and equity as guiding principles. Point number 2 acknowledges as a fundamental mission to preserve objectivity, transparency, and equality equality in electoral processes. And point number 5, we committed ourselves to double our efforts in order to improve the quality and the inclusiveness of electoral processes, always taking into account the multicultural contexts of the countries in the region, as well as the specific hardships faced by the youth, the women, indigenous communities, communities that descend from African peoples, and in general, the general public to participate in politics. And point number 8, we committed ourselves to establish a dialogue in order to fight gender-based violence, especially against women, and to design joint action plans. Item number 9, point number 9, we committed ourselves to create a group to establish guidelines and indicators for the progress of the legal protection for the participation in elections of underprivileged people and underrepresented people, and especially for to protect women as not to be victims of violence in politics. And the last one, point number 10, we bound ourselves to emphasize the equality of rights and the inclusion of underrepresented groups in politics in general. So this summary, I would like it to be a general framework for the discussions that we will hold on this regard, which is very important for modern day democracy, which is equal political participation. So it is my honor to give the floor to Luis López Guerra, Justice of the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good evening, everyone. We are in an international event. This is why I would like to congratulate the organizers. And thank you for inviting me. This is an international event, like I said before, where we have to find or discuss general application criteria, universal criteria for elections. I also see here everything that has to do with electoral systems, which are elements that feature the specificities of each country, that deals with the specific social, historical, and economic conditions of each country. So it's important to highlight the general similarities and also the specific differences. I would like to talk about the Tribunal of Strasbourg, because they have had to match universal human rights with the specificities of each country. And I think that a jurisprudence that specifies general matters, of course, the European Convention of Human Rights addresses all the democracies and the democratic issues. However, the consequences when it comes to the right to vote, and especially to the equal right to vote or the equal political participation, this has been subject to an analysis by the tribunal that takes into account the margin of appreciation, that's what we could call it, of the states, because we need to take into account, like I said, the specific differences. It is important to note that the Convention of 1950 does not specify anything regarding the right to vote. So this shows, in a certain way, the situation regarding that kind of rights, those kinds of rights. Only in the additional convention that was signed 2 years later, in 1952, an article was introduced that states that the states will have the obligation of conducting frequent electoral consultations for a legislative body. This is a very generic clause, and this has happened with many of the rights that are included here in this article. So the interpretation of this article, of the additional protocol, is that the tribunal has found several different issues. One could be making sure or verifying whether establishing an obligation on the part of the states would also help the individuals, and of course the conclusion was a positive one. The second one that it wasn't clear which elections this encompassed, because it talked about elections to the legislative body. It could happen at a national level or at a regional level in states, and the tribunal concluded that yes, it was applicable to all these levels. But what happens with municipal or local elections or presidential elections that are not legislative? What happens with referendum? So the tribunal has had to adapt very carefully the analysis of this article of the convention, but especially from a legal standpoint, of course. The Human Rights Conventions, when they acknowledge the rights, there is a possibility of certain limitations, but very restricted limitations that are for very specific cases. For instance, you can only restrict the freedom of speech and so on in specific situations that are listed in these articles. However, when it comes to the right to vote that is acknowledged by the additional protocol, no list of limitation is included. So the tribunal, taking into account this margin of appreciation of the states based on their political specificities, it has established that there is an affirmation for the right to vote, but this right is subject to inherent limits. They are not detailed, but they are limits that are as a result of the nature of the right, and the tribunal has to be the one that determines them, following criteria such as these limits had to be set forth in the law. They have to be proportional limits, and of course taking into account that these limits cannot breach any other rights acknowledged in the convention. And this has been applied to matters regarding active and passive vote in very concrete points that would lead to a greater or a broader discussion. One of them would be, until which point can we limit the right to vote from the functional standpoint? So can we limit the right to vote of prisoners, given that they might not be eligible in the minds of some people? Or what would happen when limiting the vote of people with mental illness? In Switzerland, it was established that they could not establish a general provision for the mentally ill, but they have to be reviewed in a case-by-case basis. In the Spanish Congress, a proposition has been presented eliminating any kind of restriction for the vote of the people with mental illnesses. Now, regarding the active vote, there have already been and also been discussions and rulings regarding the possible limitation of the vote. For instance, in the case against Bosnia-Herzegovina, and as you already know, Bosnia was the result of an agreement between different communities, between people from Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, and they restricted the possibility of being a candidate for the representatives of some of these communities. However, at some point, Jewish and Gypsy candidates ran for office, and the Bosnian government decided that it was necessary to integrate the three communities, so therefore it was legitimate to exclude other communities. So the tribunal considered that in this specific case there was a specific or enough peace in Bosnia as not to exclude these people, but the topic is still open. Until which point is it possible to reduce the participation of vote to create peace? Another point regarding a passive vote, which is the possibility of being elected. There was a case in the Netherlands. The Protestant party forbid women to be included in electoral lists based on the interpretation of the Bible. So the higher court of the Netherlands considered that this breached international conventions. So this political party went to the Tribunal of Strasbourg and said that their freedom of religion was being breached. because their religion wouldn't allow them to have women as candidates. The tribunal did not consider this admissible, but the case is still open. And maybe not so a political party forbidding women from participating, but there are explicit regulations in some countries that state that both sexes have to be included in these lists. So until which point is this coherent with the general right of freedom and civil liberties? So these are issues that happen with the prisoners, with people with mental illness. What happens with the limitation of this passive vote or the right to be voted? And what happens when we try to establish mandatory electoral quotas? Well, these are things that are open for discussion and would require an analysis from the legal community and the scientific community. And I think in these kinds of meetings, these kinds of meetings are very useful to reach some kind of conclusion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias al juez Luis López
Thank you
Guerra.
very much, Justice Luis López Guerra. Now we will go with the second presentation of this panel. I have the honor to give the floor to Dr. Alberto Dalla Villa, Vice President of the National Electoral Chamber of Argentina. Good evening. I would like to thank the Electoral Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary for this invitation, and I would like to say that it is my honor to participate in this panel, especially with Dr. Luis López Guerra, who, apart from being a judge of the Strasbourg Tribunal, he has been a judge of the Constitutional Tribunal of Spain, and he is a scholar in constitutional rights in Spain, and I admire him. I will try to be very quick because I promised Dania that I would give her some of my time. And I don't have a lot of time, so I think I will just give you about 1 minute. But I will quickly talk about some things that might be of interest to you from my country. I'm going to skip the introduction because the introduction deals with something that Roberto Caldas already mentioned and Daniel Sobato and José Luis Vargas Valdés already mentioned, which is to say that we move in an environment of representative democracy. Both the European Convention and the American Convention of Human Rights establish or set the minimum requirements of representative democracies. But representative democracies have been hacked. We were talking about the Latino Barometer today, but we haven't come up with anything better. Direct democracy, well, history tells us that it hasn't worked. The Inter-American Court considers different ways of representative democracy, but the problem is, what is the point? Until which point do we get to the representative part and the participation part? On my screen, I have some information regarding the participation of women in my country. We have quotas in the list for political parties. These lists are in the gender quota is in the Constitution. It's 33%, but based on a decision by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, a decree increases that participation quota so that in accordance with or based on the positions or the public offices that have to be renewed. For instance, if there's two, one of them has to be a woman. That's what happens in the Senate, for instance, in a country. And I'm going to talk about that later on, but I would just like to tell you that at the end you have two causes. One is the Ciudad Futura ruling of July 13th of this year, where there was a list that was entirely comprised of women. And then the Unión Popular Party from April 20th of this year, where the National Electoral Chamber decided that the gender quotas have to be applied also in party regulating bodies and also in the primary elections list, because we have primary elections and that's where the quota is also used. So in these elections where I don't have the final figures yet because we are still counting the votes in Argentina, I had to fly out on Wednesday and not Tuesday because we're still resolving conflicts. We had a total of 44.58% of women candidates in the lists and 55.42% men. That's the total of the lists. If you want more precise results, I have a sheet of paper with information here. I don't have a lot of time, but for instance, for the federal senator candidates, there was a 49.43% actually women and 50.57% men. So Argentina has a high participation of women, mainly due to the quotas in the list. In the last election, which was held in 2015, we had 42% women in parliament level candidates for the Mercosur, and right now, well, like I said before, we renewed on December 10, 39% in the House of Representatives and 42% women in the Senate. Also, very quickly, regarding the vote of prisoners, in the year 2000, they started voting with a special system due to a ruling from the Electoral Chamber in a collective action, and the Mignone ruling. This is a unique or a sole ballot system, but in 2016 the Electoral Chamber included all those that have already been sentenced. And following the dialogue with and applying the jurisprudence from the European Tribunal of Human Rights in a specific case from Great Britain. So this is subject to regulation in the Senate, but the Electoral Chamber ruled that the prisoners had the right to vote, and but it had to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. We have also made progress on the political participation of the native communities or indigenous communities. We have developed programs because this has something quite complex through different data. The vote of Argentine people living abroad and the vote from young people. Just recently, in 2013, we extended the participation of the youth to people would be able to vote before when they turned 18, but now they can vote when they turn 16. Any individual can ask for the information of the financial information of the political parties. You don't need to be a candidate. And we had done the same thing to challenge candidacies. We don't place online all the candidacies. I'm sorry, we place all candidacies online, and if someone has anything to say, they can contact us. There was a case of a person that was not sentenced yet, but was being prosecuted for felonies, and now we give a broad participation to all citizens. I don't have much time, so I just want to tell you about one case. The Ciudad Futura party, or the Future City political party, where there was a list completely comprised by women. In the Electoral Chamber, we have two judges. Dr. Munefa passed away in 2014, and I voted on one side, and my colleague voted on the other side. Corcuera, my colleague, is not here, but my vote was the one that won because an alternate judge voted. In Argentina, we also have a law of gender equality that was drafted by the House and approved by the Senate. And Dr. Corcuera said since there is no lower limit, there shouldn't be an upper limit for the participation of women and men. So, in my opinion, if we don't have problems with representative democracy, well, we should increase the ways people can participate, but we mustn't fall in modalities or formats that get us closer to radical democracies such as inclusive democracies that can lead us to a list that is completely comprised by men or by women or people of a certain age. I know this is a subject of discussion, but I won't vote because the alternate supported me. In this case, we also used a ruling in 2008 of the Spanish tribunal that also ruled along the same lines, that in Spain they cannot have a list that is completely comprised of women. And the name of the list in Argentina was called Women in Power, and this is why this was not allowed. I don't have time to say anything else, but I'm sure Dania will mention some of the things that I wasn't able to mention. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Dallavia, for your presentation. Now I will give the floor to Counselor from the National Electoral Institute of Mexico, Dania Paola Rabel Cuevas. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this table or this session on equal political participation. If the rights are not for all people, they are not rights anymore, and they are privileges. Inclusion is a fundamental right of democracy, which is intrinsic in democracy, so that it is not fake, that democratic promise that one day minorities can become the majority. Inclusion as a foundation of democracy provides sense to equality. And today I want to talk about some measures that we have and some steps that we have taken in the National Electoral Institute to increase political participation of equal political participation. And I will just mention four because of time constraints. One is the protocol for people with disabilities, so they can be included as poll station officials. Then the protocol so that they are not the people whose gender does not match the information in their voting card, so that they are not discriminated. Then the protocol to address political violence against women, that we have been working on with other institutions. And lastly, a very recent decision by the INE, it was just taken about 2 days ago, referring the criteria that we implement when we register candidacies and coalitions, where we can see some quotas and some affirmative actions that were taken. First, we see here that regarding the protocol to include people with disabilities as poll station officials, this arises because we realized that when we conducted the raffle to see who would be an official for the polling station, some people with disabilities wanted to be part of this polling station, but the trainers and the supervisors of the trainers said, well, no, maybe even if they want to, they won't be able to do so. So we decided to take some steps to help them participate in equal conditions. The one that is maybe the most important one is that they can be accompanied by another person so they can do what they have to do. But this has several stages. The first stage is that the other poll station officials will be let know, will be informed that another person, another official, will have a disability, and these people will be able to help him or her as long as they do the things they have to do in the polling station. If this is not possible, the second step would be to hire a trainer or to support this person. If this doesn't work because maybe the person needs someone he or she trusts fully, so this can happen as long as they have the authorization of the district level board. So what will happen is that the person that will help the person with disabilities has to meet all the requirements met by all the poll station officials. And of course, we will also inform the people that they cannot be delegating or they cannot be conducting the duties of the person with disabilities. And specific materials are given out to these individuals. Like all the materials, the training materials can be done and delivered with Braille. The second thing we have, or the next thing we have, is for the transgender community. And we must mention something very important here. Electoral institutes at a local level can be a source of good practices. In 2015, in the Electoral Institute of the Federal District, back then when it was still called Federal District, the decision was made to have leaflets, handouts outside the polling stations so that the people that are transgender, that their gender doesn't match the gender in their voting cards, were not discriminated in election day. So what we did is that there were letters letting the officials know so that the people were not discriminated that year. But the head of the council to avoid discrimination approached us and told us that's not enough because they are not reading these letters, these documents. The material has to be there inside the polling station. And the important thing to highlight here is that in 2015 we already have the sole polling stations after the 2014 reform. So we already had the rules set with the INE. So they allowed us to put these leaflets, these handouts, in the polling station. And the result was that the head of the Council to Prevent and Eradicate Discrimination in Mexico City, she told us that for the first time she hadn't received one complaint or one claim from the transgender community due to discrimination. So following that good practice, what we decided in the INE was to create a specific protocol that is permanent in term and that will be given as part of the training to the people who will perform as polling station officials. In the previous slide, we could see the picture of the material that we placed in the Federal District in the polling stations. That is the cover of the handouts that we gave out. And just to wrap up with this idea, we have the protocol to address political violence against women. I forgot something due to time constraints, but I just want to say that we haven't approved the protocol to avoid discrimination of the transgender community yet. We're still working on that, but the measures that we will adopt or we plan to adopt for this protocol is that the person will arrive to the polling station, and if the polling station official realizes that their physical appearance does not match the picture in their voter's card, he or she will ask him or her, without saying the name, if that person is the holder of the voter's card. If the person says yes, they can vote without any more specific revision or verification, because what we have seen in Mexico City is that they check to say, okay, what's the size of the ears, the distance between the eyes, the shape of the nose, but this time that won't happen. They will only be asked if he or she is the holder of the voter's card, and then they will be allowed to vote. Then now with a protocol to address political violence against women, well, here it's important to mention that this protocol came about as an answer when seeing the increase in political violence against women as a result of the 2014 reform. Because in that reform, in Article 41 of the Constitution, the parity principles was included in the participations. So we had more women in the political sphere, but we also started seeing an alarming increase in political violence against women. So to answer that, or to address that, 8 institutions joined together, the Electoral Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary, the National Electoral Institute, the specialized office to address violence against women, and also the specialized office for electoral offenses, the Subsecretariat of Human Rights of the Department of the Interior, the In Mujeres, the Commission for to protect victims, and the Commission to protect women from violence. This is very important because, on the one hand, it gives us basic definitions. What is political violence, for instance? What is political violence against women? We in Mexico, we still don't have segregated the political violence against women at a national level. So oftentimes we don't even know which situation we are facing. So there are basic definitions, such as that one, and we also included the liability scope of each one of the institutions, so that the victims or alleged victims know what are the processes or the proceedings that they have to follow. In the case of the INE, National Electoral Institute, our competence is to mainly be aware or control the political advertising or campaign advertising that promotes that violence. And we can rule to remove that advertising to avoid that violence. I'm running out of time, so I would just like to say, to wrap up, that a couple of days ago we approved in the National Electoral Institute the criteria to register or enroll candidacies and coalitions. We took two affirmative actions that are extremely relevant. One of them, to increase the number of women in the Senate, where historically they have been underrepresented, and what we did is that they have to spearhead the proportional representation list, and that would have an impact on the Senate, because that will bring as a result having more women on the Senate. And the other point has to do with indigenous communities. We in Mexico have 28 electoral districts with an indigenous population of at least 40%. So what we did is that political parties will have to appoint at least 12 candidates that are of indigenous origin, also with parity, because indigenous women are exposed to two vulnerabilities, because they are indigenous and also because they are women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mrs. Rabel. So now we are going to give the floor to Justice Lucy Janet Bermudez from the Council of State of Colombia. Good afternoon to all of you. First of all, congratulations to the organizers of this event for such an excellent scenario and for allowing us to present such an important topics. And we have named magistrates to the officials of the electoral justice, but they are administrative officials, and this custody is assigned to the judges of the administrative disputes, and they do it through the 5th section, and they close all the legal disputes on the electoral topics, as well as others, like, for example, if they annul their position because of what we were mentioning previously. I would like to tell you that some of the decisions and situations that are important regarding the equalitarian participation in Colombia are as follows. Under the perspective of inclusive participation and as affirmative actions that have been fructifying before some minorities and some groups that are vulnerable, I will tell you that in Colombia, women participation, as from Law 581 of the year 2000, it's demanding that the lists are integrated by 30% of women In the same way, it is set out that in order to have access to the directive positions in the states, they will also have 30% of women. So this has led us that when they have not reached this quota, they annul the election or the appointment of certain officials in order to abide by these numbers of the participation. Now, according to the agreements in La Habana that were formalized November last year in the Teatro Colón, we set out how there is a duty of promoting incentives in order to allow a better participation of women within the elections. We also have some measures which tend to look for equalitarian participation of disabled people, specifically blind people, through some cards of the Braille system, and the guarantee that they are going to be able to make the right decision according to those cards that we propose, that we are going to provide. Within this electoral code, it is also provided that if they have a different disability, they can go with another person when they go to vote. Nevertheless, we haven't had any dispute according to this. We also have measures guaranteeing the participation of different ethnias and different cultural communities that we have in our country. So there are 2 seats in the Senate specifically for these indigenous communities, and 2 in the houses for those African descendants. Taking into consideration that there are lots of peers abroad, we also have a seat in the House of Representatives for Colombian people who lives abroad. So through this peace process, we have 2 situations that are novelties which tend or the trend is for these minority groups or the vulnerable groups can have access to these popular election positions. The first one I'm referring to is that through the Legislative Act number 3 of 2017, a constitutional reform, we have set out that there are 5 seats in the Senate and 5 seats in the House of Representatives for the political party PARC, and this is the Armed Forces of Colombia. So in the next elections, the PARC, this new party, is going to have this participation. But we also acknowledge how Colombia, this conflict has left a great amount of victims, so we are trying to pass a project of legislative acts where we set 16 regional seats which are specifically for the residents of those areas, which typically are rural areas, and they have set some conditions that we believe at the beginning they will allow that the victims of the conflict are able to participate. This is the way where how we say that those that are going to participate cannot be members of any party of a political party, that the candidates should come from the sector of the victims of the conflict, which has to be credited by a certification from the victims unit, or by setting out that they have been born, that they have born in that they were born in that territory, and that they are a direct or indirect victim of this conflict. They cannot participate for those seats, those that are part of the traditional parties or to the park. They cannot be public servants or have been public servants or candidates for public election. And we also guarantee the participation, the equalitarian participation, because this list has to be integrated by two different lists, a man and a woman. They are going to be funded. There is a financing system that we hope that this participation is able to be carried out. In some judiciary cases where we have dealt with these kind of issues, I am going to tell you about the Election Act of the representative of the chamber, because as the African descendant community, they annulled the election because they set out that the one who resulted elected was not a member of that community. And now, regarding the gender topic, let me tell you that we annul the election of a municipal council where the party, the U Party, National Unity, in Popayan municipality, because there was no candidates in their list, they were not able to replace it by a woman. That's why the equilibrium was broken of this 30%, and that's why Section 5th of the State Council has to annul this election. So, summarizing, these are some references from Colombia that you know that is passing through an electoral situation which is quite interesting and specific, and we are going to see the results that are going to be given next year in March, May, and June with this with the dissolution of this group of FARC and in this peace process of the National Freedom Army. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Justice Lucy Janet Bermudez Bermudez of the Fifth Section of the Council of the State of Colombia. I'm not trying to make a summary of all what was said here. I'm going also to mention some of the key and central points of these presentations, and then we are going to open the floor for questions. We have had a very enlightening panel, not only in the direct testimonials of those who are in charge of carrying out or performing or applying and enforcing the law, but also a series of shades with which we have to work from the different regional and general spheres. We first have the presentation of Mr. Luis López Guerra. We have a historical presentation from the years 1950 and the rights of the states. He spoke about the freedom, the guarantees that they have, and how sometimes the enforcement of law, there are some dilemmas in order to enforce it and how to decide before these difficult situations. Dr. Alberto Dalla Via, from the experience of Argentina, spoke about some principles, including what happened with the direct democracy examples that were not very successful, what's happening with the representative democracy. He spoke about how in case of Argentina there is even a special system in order to allow the vote of prisoners, and how they address the youth, and how in their country they have a gender equality law which is current in this moment. Now, then we had Dania Paola Rabel Cuevas, a counselor from the INE. She spoke about the inclusion concept as a foundation of democracy and how to provide equality to the democratic systems. She spoke about 4 initiatives that the National Institute in Mexico is carrying out that have to do with the establishment of specific protocols in order to address all these underrepresented groups and to guarantee the protection of their rights. Disabled people, how to prevent political violence towards women, and the measures and the quotas of affirmative action that are required during the registration of candidates. And she spoke about the protocol that they have developed for the transgender community. She spoke on how this is referred to a parity logic, and it's in the sphere of responsibility of the proper authorities. And Mrs. Bermudez spoke about how from the year 2000 through Law 581 they have lists already integrated by 30% of women, and she spoke about specific measures for application and how these have been evolving in order to address the specific needs of underrepresented groups, like for example disabled people, as well as very interesting measures and innovative measures about the inclusion of ethnic groups and cultural groups in this Colombian process framework. She also spoke about very important challenges that are being developed in Colombia, and that they are going to have results in the next elections, and that have to do with the recent story of the country and the peace agreements and the transformation of these armed forces in political forces, which is a huge challenge for the country, and that this is also a lesson learned for other countries that have passed, or that we hope that we don't have to go through a similar issue. But all these lessons are very useful, and we really would like to thank you to share these ideas, because this is the goal, to meet precisely, to listen how different countries in different arenas are finding solutions or alternatives, interesting and innovative solutions, or what we are learning from all these examples that could be useful for the different countries and different regions, because what is applied in one place cannot export exactly the same or identically, but it's good for us in order to know how democracy is evolving in our world. Now I will open the floor for the audience. We have three people that have asked for the floor. First of all, Magister Aswanto from Indonesia, and you have 3 minutes for your comment, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Justice. Muchísimas gracias, señora presidenta. Me gustaría compartir
equal political participation in Indonesia. Indonesia is working very hard to provide equal opportunity to women. This effort is manifested in the policy to ratify various international conventions in relation to this matter. Indonesia has ratified several conventions such as Convention on the Political Rights of Women, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is an effort to establish gender equality in the provide a level playing field between men and women in political sphere. Protection of right to vote, providing access to for people with disability. The law provides equal access for people with disability, either disability in seeing or the physical disability, to participate in election. The constitutional protection for people with disability is regulated in Article 28, Paragraph 2 and of the 1945 Constitution, which gives special treatment as means to achieve equality and justice. This put the recruitment to the physically fit to run or to vote in an election. The law states that disability is an exception. Physical disability is not categorized as physically unfit in casting to vote. The law provides that shall be assisted and is provided with specially an aid and facility to use their right to vote. The use of ID card and the casting to vote. In 2040 election, there was problem the voters in Indonesia. Lots of members of the public who were eligible to vote objective, then their names were not registered in the voter list, and they might cause them to lose their right to vote. Very effort was done to solve the problem, but seems to no avail. This problem is brought to Constitutional Court. The court decision provides a way out for the problem. The court states that valid identity cards for passport can be used by those who are not registered in the voters list. The court set up recruitment of the use of ID card to vote. The court stipulate, among others, that ID card or passport can be used to vote one or before closing of the poll station. This decision was effective in guarantee the public of exercise their right to vote. Noken as voting mechanism in Papua. Noken is voting system used in some district in Papua. This is the custom of Papua people which has been passed to throughout generation. Noken can be defined as public agreement in nominating to leader to system is the use in electing to leaders. In general election, this system is also used dispute some concerns that might violate the principle of free, fair, direct, and secret manner in election. The system is still allowed to consider it constitutional to be applied in some district in Papua. The Constitutional Court asserted to constitutionality of this system in this decision on the ground to the that is based on local customary law which is guaranteed by the Constitution. However, the court also stated that system shall be temporary in nature. The Election Commission shall continue to educate to people to use the voting mechanism as regulated by the law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing the experience of Indonesia. Vamos ahora a darle la palabra a Gabriela Villafuerte.
Gabriela Villafuerte Coello, please.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon to all of you.
Pues bueno, más que
More than questions and answers, the truth is that I think that there are lots of considerations to make in this regard, but I also think that there are some important opportunity areas to reflect on this. When we speak about inclusion topics and inclusion of some minority groups or vulnerable groups or disabled people or different ethnics or indigenous people. But when we speak about women, the first thing that we have to observe is that we are not a vulnerable group. We should not be treated as a vulnerable group because we are 51% of the population in this world. So, here is my first reflection or comment. I think that when we associate inclusion or the progress of women, immediately, as Dania was mentioning, violence is present. The threat of this progress of women creates violence, undoubtedly. In Mexico, we will undergo an election with 3,400 of positions. So the thing here is to see if we are going to have 1,700 women occupying public positions. That's what we should aim for. We believe that in the Constitution, parity was there and it's there to stay. But no, the obligation is to appoint, to nominate. We have opportunity areas to achieve access and that women remain in their positions. We have to eliminate violence before, during, and after, so that these political violence outbursts or against women, who I reiterate, we are not a minority and we are not a vulnerable group. So I think that as countries we can find opportunity areas to make true this world of 50-50. We have to live a 50-50 world. I think that there lies the task that we have in front of us. I believe that today, and this is a very personal standpoint, to discuss or to be reluctant against any kind of action to include, on the one hand, minority groups or vulnerable groups, or to include women, there is already the violence. The discussion should not be there. The discussion, I think, that should be in the way to achieve that we really occupy the power seats without violence. We are living a world, and this is the way it is. It is a men world. So as women, we all, as a society, have to walk towards teaching the way so that men release power. They have to release half of their power, but I also believe that we also need to teach them that it has to be free of violence. I think that this is the reality. This is an epidemic, violence against women, and political violence is observed everywhere, in every scenario, in very subtle ways. So we need to wear glasses with a high augmentation in order to be able to acknowledge violence. This is a reflection, a comment from myself. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Gabriela Villafuerte from the Specialized Chamber. Now we are going to give the floor to Mr. Juan Carlos Silva from Mexico. Good afternoon to all of you. I would like to start this brief intervention with a very brief phrase. If you are a good judge, you have to start by ruling your home. And I think that we have spoken about the way we make the lists and access to public office or charges, etc. But we also have to have this parity in all the organizations, the bodies, in the electoral judiciary, etc. A message like this, I think that it would speak about consistency, coherence regarding all the this speech of equality that we are in this moment pronouncing. I think that this is important, but we have been focusing on the decentralized bodies, local and district bodies, where the invitations that they make in order to integrate the local councils and the district councils, we have to take into consideration also the parity and emphasizing more the participation of women. But I am very clear that this sometimes is a matter that is out of our hands, because it has to do with the appointing processes of the main bodies, and this is a responsibility of the legal bodies. Thank you very much, Mr. Silva, for your briefness. The next individual is Judith Arenas. So we'll give her the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, not only for the excellent examples, but also for these enlightening comments in this debate. I think that these last two interventions of the floor show us that there is much more to do regarding this matter. I'm going to be brief because the two individuals that spoke before me have already addressed these topics, but it's very important for me to drive the nomination for these positions. But we have to have free of violent environments. Today, this morning, we have heard about the new challenges that we have, and in the next session, we are going to have lots of information to discuss and to face the challenges in the digital world. So I think that we have to get together these two opinions and perspectives and to find a way on how to face intimidation and gender violence that is present in the digital means. And the other one was I think that it's important that we, when we speak of the dimension of the inclusion of all the people, we have to also take into consideration all the bodies, I mean, the whole chain of the electoral process. And along these lines, we have to ensure that the populations that we would like to include are reflected in the bodies that are going to be leading, monitoring, overseeing those elections and those processes. We also know that there are certain topics, certain dimensions that increase the trust on certain bodies that are representing the population, specifically for gender, disabilities, etc. issues. So I would like to tell you that we, within our organization, have a very interesting project on how to drive the participation of women in the justice sector, which is pretty important to share with you. We have some recommendations that we can share with all the participants, and I think that it is amazing to see that when we analyze such recommendations, the justice sector is not such different from the other sectors, but only the fact to be able to ask and to see which are those hindrances are going to give us the right answers. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comment and also for being so brief. Our next participation is going to be done by Mr. Roman Cadena from the International Commission of Jurists. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. I would like to stress out something that is pretty interesting that we have as a common basis from Dr. Lopez Guerra and Dr. Dallavia, which is this jurisprudential dialogue. I think it's pretty important, as you were mentioning, for example, to apply the ruling of a European tribunal from Europe in Argentina, or vice versa. And I think that we have the right forum of judges and of justices, and this is important for this global network on electoral justice. This is in the first instance. In the second instance, to link this to this topic, to the previous one, to illicit financing, because undoubtedly illicit financing of political campaigns is impacting the right to equality. Hence, we also would like to call upon your reflection to see which is the contribution for this in order to achieve a better equality and contribution. And finally, I would like to tell you that I share with you and I agree with you as an organization regarding quotas, etc. But going back to what Dr. Zavala mentioned this morning, along the lines or regarding the fact, if I understood well, how to retribute, to how to give back to the peoples with the rulings, how to give the power back to the people, and how to make this that the power is in the peoples and not in the elite. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Cadena, for your comments. And now we are going to have 2 minutes to each of the panelists. I have promised that you were going to have 3 minutes, but so I apologize. You are going to have only 2 minutes for the final reflections or to react or to answer the comments in the floor. So we are going to give you the floor. First of all, Mr. Lopez Guerra, Justice of the European Court of Human Rights. In a very brief manner, I mean, this has been a very interesting topic. First, on equality due to gender or gender-based. Another one, disabled-based injustice, physical or moral. Another one due to social and political disabilities. So I would like to address the 3 of them, but I can only speak about one. The disabilities. The right to vote could be seen in 2 different areas. One as a human right, and the other one as a duty or a task to contribute, to improve, and to enhance the government of the countries. If we follow these lines, or these 2 different lines, we have different answers or different goals. So we cannot hinder the right to the vote to these kind of people. Nevertheless, if we have the standpoint that the right to vote is a duty, we can restrict it because of age, because they don't have the right age, or because they have psychological problems, or because they have they are morally disqualified, like prisoners, etc. So when the Tribunal of Strasbourg considered that we cannot hinder we cannot hinder them from voting, then if they were, for example, in prison, they were not qualified to decide in these matters. Now, regarding the disabilities, well, we can discuss this. In fact, the Convention of the United Nations regarding the rights of the disabled people provides the promotion and political participation of these people in public matters, but we can also think that they are not qualified as people that are not of age, for example. But if I had to give an answer, the answer would be that they need to make individual and customize in each one of the cases. So the general approval, for example, for prisoners to vote, are not compatible with the vision of the right to vote as a human right. Now, up to where this customization is enough or not for, in many cases, to satisfy the exercise of a human right. In Spain, we have a bill of law or a proposal to take into consideration the right to vote of the physically disabled by eliminating the exams in order to verify if they are disabled or not. This idea that we have mentioned that women are not a vulnerable sector, let's think in cultural inertia. The huge cultural pressure that we have about the situation of women in the world. In Saudi Arabia, for example, women are, because of tradition and because of all and religion, etc. Isn't this a vulnerable group? I mean, we can discuss for hours and hours about this, but I think that this is the proof that these are very important things that cannot be solved in a very easy manner. Thank you very much for your intervention, and we are going to give the floor to Dr. Alberto Dallavia from the National Electoral Chamber of Argentina.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to comment on what Mr. Lopez Guerra said. In Argentina, we had a recent reform on the civil and commercial code. So what was before for electoral judges, the ineligibility, that was included in the people with disabilities, so they wouldn't vote. So the relationship between active and passive vote was considered as two sides of the same coin. But now we have about 15 types of disabilities. There are young people that have capabilities for certain things, with consent, without consent. That has changed a lot. So we had a conflict where a civil judge said, okay, this person cannot enter into agreements, but they can vote. So the first instance judge said no. He can vote, or he can either not vote. So they said, okay, he can't vote. So that made us open up interpretation and jurisprudence where the concept of active and passive vote is more and more separated. Just like what's happening with the people, with the prisoners, now that happens, the same thing happens with the people with disability. So we are more open to allow the people to vote, because that allows them for a greater social participation than to be a candidate where we have more restriction. And that's what's happening, at least in our jurisprudential framework. And I also agree that it can be because of a natural thing due to, we cannot consider women as an inferior group, of course, but in our jurisprudence, even in the compared jurisprudence, when we look behind, a colleague that had just written a book on equality locates them, the women, as underprivileged group because they are fighting historic inequality. And that historic inequality is the one that has justified this positive action. So the question, because I ran out of time already, the question is, until which point will we get with the positive actions? What will be the limit of our actions there? That's something we have to think about, because our goal is equal opportunities and the representative system per se. And going back to the question of from the doctor of the Association of Jurists. So I think this is a very deep and profound topic, but basically we try to compensate historic inequalities so we can all have the same opportunities and possibilities. So this also has to be discussed because, like Lopez Guerra said, just like all the things in this branch of law, we have to look into the context. We can have good intentions, but not all situations and not all realities are the same. Not all countries are the same. So we have to look into that. Thank you very much, Dr. Dallavia. Now, Dalia Paola Rabel from the National Electoral Institute of Mexico will give her final comments. Thank you very much. Justice Villafuerte has mentioned something that's very interesting. Women are a vulnerable group. I like to use the definition of Judith Butler, who said that vulnerability is the self-awareness of collective or individual precariousness that is acted upon to change the pre-established order. So if we use this definition of vulnerability, I think women can fit in here. But we have to take into account that that vulnerability is not defined by the people who are part of that vulnerable group. Is defined by the people outside that group, the society that is discriminating them, in this case discriminating women. So without a doubt, we are not a minority. However, this does not define the possible vulnerability we are exposed to in different environments. Of course, this is a topic where there's no consensus. Even the feminist groups, they don't agree on the topic, but I just wanted to make this comment. Now, it's also important what Justice Silva was saying. I have said in different events that we have to have parity permeate into different bodies. For instance, the Electoral National Institute is appointing the general council positions of local institutions with parity. However, the phenomenon that we start to see now is that this parity is not permeating towards the lower positions. For instance, we have general councils made up of men and women in parity, but the executive secretariat, the holders of the unit, the leaders of the unit, those positions are held mainly by men, and we see that also in the National Electoral Institute, and that's a self-criticism. Of course, it's not just saying, okay, we need to fire all the executive directors or have a draw and then have women there. That's not the way to do it, but if naturally that position is available, if we have two people, one man and women, with the same qualities, maybe we should give preference to the woman. But of course, this is a self-criticism topic where we are seeing parity in all the different organizations, but we also see this phenomenon. But maybe at the top we can find women, but it's not cascading down. What Judith Arenas has also said is also very relevant. That's happening in Mexico. Women are holding public office now. However, they cannot exercise their powers in a normal way. This is why the protocol to address political violence against women was created. And I also have my card here. I ran out of time, so that's all I have to say. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Rabel. Now I will give the floor to Lucy Janet Bermudez, Justice of the Fifth Section of the Council of State of Colombia. Thank you very much. In order to be brief, I would like to say that I share the opinion of Dania regarding women belonging in the vulnerability group. I think that definitely the circumstances that are present nowadays are the ones that determine that we are still a vulnerable group. Vulnerable because we are ruled by laws that are predominantly benefiting men, and in order to break the glass ceiling, Dania was saying, all the things that she said need to happen. Now, in order to have more clarity on the violence and to establish mechanisms to limit this, we need to generate forums where we can have the conditions to become competitive and to eliminate all the barriers, so that the acknowledgement of that vulnerability will lead us to ask for that steps. And the second point has to do with what Mr. Cadena said regarding how to give the power back to the people, because equal participation has to lead us there, because the sovereignty has to be based on the people. So from the fifth section of the Council of State of Colombia, we have been working on this task, and we have been considering that the elected has a subjective right, so that the analysis and the interpretation is done based on the pro-electoratum principle that teaches how any interpretation of the electoral right must include the popular will, the will of the people. Even though when all the comments that you all made are extremely interesting, I cannot make any further comments because of the time constraints. Thank you. Thank you very much, dear panel members. Thank you, all attendees, for your contributions. So we will now close this session on equal political participation. Thank you very much. I thank the participation of the panel members, and now we will invite you to have the fourth and last session of today, the digital revolution in the political life, the involvement of electoral jurisdictions. This session will start immediately.